Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. It's Wednesday, November 6th, 2019. Today, we're going to talk about the Second Amendment and the right to keep and bear arms. More importantly, we're going to be focusing primarily on efforts or strategy to nullify federal gun control. That is, to stop federal gun control without relying on the federal government to stop it, which never seems to happen. Now, this is something that you should hear a lot about in the coming months, at least a pretty significant amount. And hopefully, as we get into the beginning of the state legislative sessions for 2020, we'll be monitoring this very closely. So today I'm going to first start out by giving you guys a refresher on some strategy from Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Those of you who've been with me since the beginning of the show or who are close followers of our work here at TAC, a lot of this is going to be not new to you, but I will keep that part short. And for those of you who it is new to, I'm going to talk about it briefly and then reference some articles and other episodes that you can dig in on to understand strategy from Jefferson and Madison more closely. I also want to cover briefly some legislation introduced and then also passed in Oklahoma, and then some legislation introduced in Florida. I'll do my best to get to that, but primarily I want to focus on legislation that we've crafted that you can use right now to get introduced on a state or a local city or a county level in your area to help you work to undermine, reject, resist, and nullify federal gun control, because all that federal gun control, every single piece of it, every act, order, law, rule, regulation of the federal government regarding firearms, firearm accessories, and ammunition is unconstitutional and needs to be stopped. So let's get to work on that. First of all, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. We broadcast live with a video version through YouTube, Facebook, DLive, Twitch, and Periscope. We also have archived video versions through bittubers.com. It's an interesting name, but we're getting some pretty decent reach there right to start out, and I'm very grateful for everyone watching there. Thank you so very much. Brighteon.com, which is Mike Adams' site, which is going to be a site that we can rely on to be censorship resistant, I believe, as we get attacked from other platforms. And then there's also BitChute.com. We also have the podcast-only, audio-only edition at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, and elsewhere. You can find all of our archives, all the ways to follow us, email, social media, the links that I mentioned for our show notes here. When I talk about another episode, you generally will find that, or an article, you'll generally find that in the show notes for the episode that we're on. And then, of course, the ways to support us financially through our membership program as little as $2 a month. All of that information, all the ways to follow us, and all the other archives and episodes and all the good stuff is over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And before getting to all the details, I do want to say hi to everyone out in the live chat. I think it's so awesome that you guys are interested in hearing what I have to say, and hopefully we can amplify this message and get it out to more and more people around the country, that we don't have to rely on Washington, D.C. to limit itself if we want to expand liberty. Hello to Richard Kramer, who says, I'm doing well and have recovered. That is really good to hear. Every time I've seen you out there, I'm curious how things are going for you, so I'm glad to see you're fully recovered, Richard, and thank you for being here. EHP training, good to hear from you, buddy. And I'm going to be very interested to see what's going on down in your state regarding constitutional carry, or if you found anyone willing to carry a Second Amendment Preservation Act on a state or even a local level. So keep me in the loop on that by email. Justin Morrison, Bob Brewer, Dan Reed, Timothy Martin, Richard Banks, and everybody else. I'm sure I'm skipping over a few people. I'm trying to do my best scrolling through this. Oh, and good to see Clay Davis as well out in Kentucky. Good to see you, buddy. Appreciate you being here with us. And everyone, whether you're watching live or in the archive, I'm very grateful for you spending some time with me today. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Anyways, let's get to this. First of all, I want to start out with a quick refresher on some strategy for nullification. I did an entire episode on this back in June of this year. Thomas Jefferson's strategy for nullification. If you are really interested in some of the nitty-gritty details on how he wanted things to be approached to defeat federal programs, that's the episode. I will link it in the show notes. to make sure that you guys can go back and reference that as well. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. We publish that generally about a half hour to an hour after the live show is done broadcasting in the morning. So to start out, his strategy that we talk about in that episode is really looking towards the Kentucky resolutions of 1798, where even though nullification didn't come from there, that's not the beginning of nullification. Jefferson didn't create the idea of nullification, which a lot of people, I think, wrongly assert. This is not from Jefferson. This is a long history, not only in the American tradition, but beyond that as well. But this is one of the places where it was first formalized as a principle in writing, even though I would say Patrick Henry's Kentucky or Virginia resolves to the Stamp Act also highlighted some of this as well. But just a few quick quotes from here. Jefferson started out, this is the beginning of the Kentucky resolutions of 1798, authored by Thomas Jefferson in secret, but we know it was him later on. He said, quote, "Resolved, the several states composing the United States of America are not united on the principle of unlimited submission to their general government." And this is really important to start out with this piece of philosophical truth, because everything else flows from that. This is the foundation. The federal government did not create the states. The people of the several states created the federal government. And they didn't create that federal government so they could just be dictated to. In fact, the idea that the federal government would have a national veto power over all actions of the state governments was actually considered by the people in the Philadelphia Convention in 1787, and they rejected it. So we know for a fact that this was an option to the founders, to the framers of the Constitution, and they said, no, we're not going to go with that route. We're going to go with a situation where the federal government is authorized to do stuff that's been delegated to it, and everything else is left to the states. They call it dual sovereignty, even though I think that that is not necessarily a good term for it, because in the American system, it's the people of the several states that are sovereign, and no government is sovereign. Each governing entity is delegated powers by the people that they deal with respectively. Anyways, so that is the foundation. The states are not united on a principle of unlimited submission to their general government. In other words, the general government may do stuff. They may push them around from time to time, but at some point there's a line in the sand where they're saying no more, and they don't have to continue to submit. And here's an example of what that line in the sand is. And Jefferson was pretty hardcore on this. He said, whensoever, meaning every single time, the general government, that's the federal government, assumes undelegated powers. In other words, does stuff that is not authorized to it in the Constitution or delegated to it in the Constitution. Its acts are unauthoritative, void, and of no force. Let me read that straight through again. Whensoever the general government assumes undelegated powers, its acts are unauthoritative, void, and of no force. In other words, it shouldn't be recognized. It shouldn't be supported. The states should not be helping effectuate them. And Jefferson goes into a little bit more detail. And in this resolution, if you haven't read it yet, I do urge you to read through it. Also, of course, you can just go back to that amazing episode, Thomas Jefferson's Strategy for Nullification, and hear about this in more detail. But after this was passed, he quickly sent it off, a copy of it, to his friend James Madison in Virginia. And he wrote this letter that accompanied it on November 17th. So this was first passed on November 10th, I believe, in the House in Kentucky, and then a few days later in the Senate, and then signed by the governor either on the 16th or the 17th. And then he immediately sent a letter off to Madison. And he wrote this: I enclose you a copy of the draft of the Kentucky Resolves. I think we should distinctly affirm all the important principles they contain. We need to affirm all those principles so as to hold to that ground in the future. In other words, we always have to have our ultimate principles supporting the Constitution and liberty in mind. We don't back off on those in order to make deals. We still hold our principles. Sometimes we hold our nose and say, okay, I'm going to support this over that because I'm going to have way less bad or maybe slightly better this way or another. But always hold to the ultimate principles and remind people when you're holding your nose that you're not your principles are much stronger than what's going on. So he said we should distinctly affirm all the important principles so we can hold to that ground in the future and leave the matter in such a train as that we may not be committed absolutely to push the matter to extremities, and yet may be free to push as far as events will render prudent. In other words, the strategy for nullification is look at events on the ground, look at the situation at hand, and recognize our ultimate principle, which is that every single time the federal government does something that is not authorized or delegated to it in the Constitution, it's null and void. It's unauthoritative and of no force, and it needs to be treated that way. But we have to consider the events on the ground and figure out how to get from point A to point B. Point B, how do you render them ineffective in practice? Now, James Madison also gave us some advice on how to do this in Federalist 46, and you'll hear me talk about this all the time. I will never stop talking about it because it's so incredibly important. My friend Joe Wolverton over at the New American is writing a book. I don't know if he's doing it for New American or as an independent author, but he's probably most known as a blogger over there. But he's writing a book on Federalist 46 that, Joe, if you're paying attention this time, or if you're watching on this episode, I am definitely going to get that blurb. Joe was kind enough to ask me to write a blurb for the book by the middle of this month, and I have that on my list to get done. Anyway, so Federalist 46 is incredibly important because James Madison was talking to people who are concerned about the new federal government having too much power. Well, how do you deal with it? Well, he told us specifically enough states following 4 steps, and none of those 4 steps included suing the federal government in the federal courts or hoping that the new federal elections would bring in new people that would stop the federal power. It was all focused on actions at a state, local, and individual level, primarily focused on this: a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. And he said when enough states do this, when the sentiments of several adjoining states happen to be in union, would present obstructions which the federal government would hardly be willing to encounter. In other words, when enough people in enough states refuse to cooperate with officers of the union, plus a number of other things, then there's no way the feds are going to be able to deal with this. So Jefferson says every single time they violate the Constitution, nullify them. Madison talks about a practical strategy to actually undermine and bring those to an end. These are about a decade apart, but still they're definitely tied to each other as far as strategy and approach. So this is really important stuff. Now let's tie it in to federal gun control. We can look at events on the ground. We can look at the Constitution, and we can acknowledge that there's only one thing that the federal ATF is authorized to do under the Constitution. One thing the ATF is authorized to do under the Constitution, and that is disband. But a federal agency is never going to eliminate itself. Congress is never going to eliminate it. And obviously the executive branch, no matter which team is in charge, is not going to do anything to restrict its power to continue to enforce things. It's not calling, the executive branch never calls for an end to the ATF, although it needs to be gone because every single federal gun control measure is a violation of your natural right to keep and bear arms. It's a violation of the Constitution. It's a violation of the Second Amendment to the Constitution, which is part of the Constitution because it was an amendment to it. And we need to treat those. We have to first acknowledge what Jefferson told us. Every single time they assume undelegated power. So every single time that they have a gun control measure, whether it's the National Firearms Act of 1934 or the bump stock ban of 2018, there is nothing in the Constitution which delegates to the federal government the authority to ban that stuff. Period. So we have to then recognize it or see it in law and under the Constitution as unauthoritative, void, and of no force. But how do we get, again, from point A, where things are today, to point B? Well, let's first look at the ATF. The ATF, and I just pulled this up last night. I'm looking at the 2018 ATF fact sheet. They publish these once a year. It was a little late this year, didn't come out till May, but they tell us about their overall kind of what they've been doing. And I've looked at these for a number of years, and the numbers tend to stay about the same. We know how much personnel they have, we know how much money they spend, we know how many cases they recommend for prosecution, we know how many they indict, how many people they convict, and on and on. And you can just look at the number. I should probably just do an overall graph or a chart over a 4, 5, maybe 10-year span so you guys can see how this is played out. But we know, and I've actually overestimated the number of ATF agents in a number of speeches and articles and probably on this show in the past. And now I learn it's actually less than what I've been saying, which is a positive. And here's why. Okay, the ATF has 2,634 special agents. They have 842 operations investigators. They call them Industry Operations Investigators, IOI. So this is about 3,400 agents that are involved in operations investigation and enforcement. Their overall full-time employees is 5,100. 1,600 of these are in administration. And for those of you who gloss over when it comes to numbers and statistics, the short version, the ATF for the whole country has about 3,500 people who are involved in enforcement. And anybody who runs a business that is reliant on resources or manpower, person power, whatever you want to call it, to get the job done, knows that you can only do so much with so many people because they work a limited number of hours and there's a physical limit to how much they can get done. And we know that year in and year out, every single year, and it dips up and down, they close somewhere around 8,000 to 10,000 cases per year. The ATF has a capacity of 8,000 to 10,000 cases. And mind you, they have a capacity of 8,000 to 10,000 cases and in almost every single jurisdiction in the country. Almost every single jurisdiction in the country, the ATF gets material support and enforcement resources from state and local law enforcement agencies. So let's go back to what Madison had to say. He said a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union in a number of localities or a number of states will make a federal enforcement nearly impossible. It'll make it incredibly difficult. And Judge Napolitano at some point in the last few years, as we were working on this in response to Obama gun control proposals, said the same. Nearly impossible to enforce. And although I would like 100% impossible, I will take nearly impossible to enforce over the way things are today. So they can close about 8,000 cases. But there are millions of guns. There are millions of people in the country. There's no way they have the manpower or the resources to close many more. I know the current administration actually recently bragged just in the last few months that they currently have done more closed cases than anyone in history. So the amount of federal gun control happening now is more than ever, at least on the enforcement end. So what happens if the states and local communities stop helping the federal government in this? Well, we already know what happens on other issues. The federal enforcement machine falls to pieces. It doesn't do a very good job. It has a lot of problems. That's exactly what James Madison told us would happen. And surprise, surprise, the so-called father of the Constitution, even though that's the wrong term for him, but a lot of people know him as that. Madison, very influential, very strong understanding of how the whole structure works, told us that when states and local communities stopped helping the federal government would have an extremely difficult time enforcing their so-called laws. Now, this was also at a time when James Madison wrote this, and when Jefferson was talking about this even 11 years later, they were talking about this at a time when the federal government was absolutely tiny. It wasn't involved in every aspect of our lives. It wasn't telling people how big their toilet could be, what kind of candles or, for us, light bulbs they could own, there were no federal gun control measures. The military was tiny. Their overall expenditures, the size of the federal workforce was minute compared to today. And even then, at a time when the federal government was close to or supposedly within its constitutional box, far closer than anything in our lifetime and anyone alive today could even dream of. At that time, mere noncompliance with a federal enforcement would render those in a situation where the feds wouldn't be able to overcome it, according to James Madison. Not my words, Madison's words. So we know with only the ability to close about 8,000 cases per year, They recommended in 2018 11,000, almost 11,000 for prosecution. These are gun crimes, gun enforcement on a federal level. Mind you, they only have, I think the number is 19 explosives agents for the entire country. 19. They don't have the capacity if there is mass refusal to participate. So that's why I think this bill filed, even though I don't think it's necessarily the best or most all-encompassing bill, from Senator Nathan Dahm in Oklahoma, SB 1081. This was pre-filed for the 2020 legislative session, which I think starts in early February in Oklahoma. But he has actually filed a lot of really good legislation to nullify, undermine, resist federal gun control in recent years. But this one, I think he's recognizing that the strong push from Washington, D.C. now is for red flag laws. So he has this piece of legislation. What is it called? Let me open it up here. SB 1081. It's called, come on. It was going to be called the Anti-Red Flag Act. So this has been filed in Oklahoma. If you live in Oklahoma, you definitely want to support this. Basically what it's doing is it's removing the ability of state or local governments to provide any enforcement capability or resources towards the implementation of a federal red flag law. Here's from the report from Mike Meharry that we published yesterday. The proposed law would prohibit any Oklahoma agency or any political subdivision from accepting any federal grants to implement any federal statute, rule, or executive order, federal or state judicial order, or judicial findings that would have the effect of forcing an extreme risk protection order against or upon a citizen of Oklahoma. Going on, it would also make it a felony offense for any individual, including a law enforcement officer, to enforce a federal red flag law. In effect, this would bar state and local police from enforcing a federal red flag law. And again, there are still about 3,500, 23 active special agents for the ATF, 3,500 in total. They can do, it looks to be about 3 to 4 closed cases per year per agent. 10,000 maybe. Let's say they really ramped up their capacity. The administration was able to really squeeze them out and get maybe a 20% increase this year. Get them up to 10,000, maybe double it, 16,000. But if everyone in Oklahoma starts defying this, or if people in neighboring Texas start defying it, or in Arizona or Colorado or wherever it may be, 16,000 is not, it's still a problem, but it's not going to go very far at all. And so this is actually an example of implementing or attempting to implement James Madison's strategy and Thomas Jefferson's recommendation of looking to the events on the ground and pushing as far as events will render prudent. Now, if you don't want to just deal with red flag laws, I don't think red flag laws are the end of it, clearly. Every federal gun control measure, again, should not exist. And there are tons of them on the books. Again, I will repeat. The National Firearms Act of 1934, the Gun Control Act of 1968, its amendments of 1986, the Undetectable Firearms Act of 1988, the bump stock ban of 2018, and everything in between, the federal background check system, all the surveillance, the pre-crime that I talked about in the most recent episode, all this stuff kind of ties together. And it only works if they get help and participation from state and local governments, state and local law enforcement. And that's why we have legislation called the Second Amendment Preservation Act, which we have been pushing for a number of years. We've got a line in the sand that's already been passed into law in Idaho, which doesn't cover all federal gun control, but does from, I believe, 2016 and forward, somewhere around there, 2015, 2016 and forward, so anything new. So Idaho is restricted from enforcing this. There's legislation in Kansas that sets a really good foundation that's been somewhat problematic, but there's also a piece of legislation that passed in Alaska that, again, sets... We've had a lot of difficulty. For some reason, a lot of people in the gun rights community don't want to do anything outside of a court action. And I'll tell you what, if you're relying on a federal court to protect you from the federal government ripping you off and taking your right to keep and bear arms and locking you in prison for exercising your natural right, you are going to be really sorry. If the courts even have enough capacity to take all the cases that are necessary to really protect this right the way it should be, most of the judges are not on our side. Even the so-called good ones are not on our side. Don't rely on this. And it's essential to shift our approach from and strategy from hoping to get the NRA-backed team in Washington, D.C., as supposedly they're going to reduce gun control when they don't once again. Focus our strategy elsewhere other than national elections and national court cases. And we are following the advice of James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, and actually many other founders to take action on a state, local, and individual level, whether the federal government wants us to or not. So let's take a look at this. And I do want to point out Essential Freedom. I appreciate your comment on this because I know you're out in Missouri, that there's been a lot of efforts on this in Missouri. Essential Freedom points out that this does include the legislation that's been proposed and pushed in Missouri does include the NFA. We're expecting to see a new bill filed. Pre-filing in Missouri is December 1st, so we should expect to see this happen in another piece of legislation filed in Missouri in the next few weeks, and we'll be reporting on that as well. Anyway, so it's similar to what we are talking about here. Again, this link will be in the show notes. You can download it. It's a PDF. You can send the link over to your state legislator and state senator and say, look, I support the right to keep and bear arms. I would like you to introduce this. That's it. I'm in your district. Here's my name. Please let me know. That's it. Even if you think that they're an enemy, send it to them. Just send an email. It takes 2 minutes, and that's it. So there's some findings in the legislation. It specifically talks about that the right to keep and bear arms is a fundamental individual right. Period. It also talks about the intent of the legislature to prevent local government, local law enforcement agents from being commandeered into the enforcement capacity of the federal government to violate people's rights, to violate restrictions on federal power under the Second Amendment, to violate restrictions on state power under the various state constitutions as well, and that this right should be enforced on a state level. So the prohibitions actually are pretty straightforward. No one working for the state government is allowed to knowingly and willingly participate in any way in the enforcement of any federal act, law, order, rule, or regulation issued, enacted, promulgated, or in effect on or after date regarding a personal firearm, firearm accessory, or ammunition. In other words, there is, and we could actually just remove personal from that legislation as well. Just firearm, firearm accessory, or ammunition really is the best way to do it. And in fact, I'm going to do an update on that to clarify because that's lifted from some old language. We need to remove that. So basically, any federal act, law, order, rule, or regulation regarding firearms, firearm accessories, or ammunition should not get any assistance, material support, logistics, enforcement assistance, investigation help, anything from state or local law enforcement. They are also not allowed to utilize any assets, state funds, or funds allocated by the state to local entities to engage in any activity that aids a federal agency, basically in the same enforcement priorities, period. And there also includes penalties. So agents of the state and their political subdivisions, which are state and local or local governments, law enforcement agencies, and the like, they can get fined. They can get civil penalties for doing this. Misdemeanor. We can ramp that up. I know there's been more aggressive penalties proposed in places like Missouri. I also want to point out just briefly that I did this episode just last week. Not all sanctuaries are cut from the same cloth, talking about briefly efforts to do the same type of thing on a local level. I also pointed out that a number of efforts on a local level, both in Oregon and Illinois, are taking a very bad approach. I do encourage you to actually listen to that episode if you haven't yet, because what they are passing in most places, and we're also seeing the same thing happen in Texas, where 5 or 7 counties are passing things that they are claiming to be gun rights sanctuary counties, and really in practice and effect, they are doing 100% of nothing. They have zero practical implementation effect on the enforcement of federal or state gun control, period. So that is an episode I encourage you to listen to. We do also have recommended model legislation for a state, for a city, and in many cases, a county level, a Second Amendment preservation ordinance. And again, it recognizes that all federal acts, laws, orders, rules, or regulations regarding firearms, firearm accessories, and ammunition are a violation of the Second Amendment, period, and then banning the resources. Exactly how James Madison told us. He said, use legislative devices and then a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. James Madison said do this. We're literally just implementing it. We've seen it implemented in other areas, and it's time to implement it on the right to keep and bear arms, because the pro-Second Amendment people, the claimed pro-Second Amendment people, are awful on the Second Amendment in most situations. I also want to point out that we do support constitutional carry legislation. I don't like the term constitutional carry because it implies that you get your gun permit is a Second Amendment. But it's the most commonly known term, so people understand it. We like to call it permitless carry because you shouldn't have to get a permission slip to own a firearm, to carry it concealed or outwardly. And I think the reason that we get behind these so much is because the more that you create a culture of individual responsibility, of the right to keep and bear arms on an individual level rather than on a government level, the more unlikely it becomes that new gun control can actually take effect. We see this play out in the marijuana issue all the time. And so, for example, and I'll cover that briefly, just on November 1st, Mike Meharry, we've got this article about HB 2597 in Oklahoma, where a constitutional carry law went into effect. It makes it legal to carry firearms concealed without a license, and he says will also foster an environment more hostile to federal gun control. And this is how Mike sums it up. I think it's pretty good. While permitless carry bills do not directly affect federal gun control, the widespread passage of permitless concealed carry laws, or just permitless carry laws, in states subtly undermines federal efforts to regulate guns as well. As we've seen with marijuana and industrial hemp, a federal regulation becomes ineffective when states ignore it and pass laws encouraging the prohibited activity anyway. So the more that people are used to seeing people carry their means of self-defense, the more likely they are to be less opposed to it in practice. And that's why we want to encourage a culture of self-defense as well. And Mike puts it this way: state actions such as passing HB 2597 in Oklahoma, it lowers barriers for those wanting the option of defending themselves with firearms, and encourages a gun-friendly environment that makes federal efforts to limit firearms that much more difficult. I also want to point out, I got to refresh this. Hopefully this will pull up. A similar bill was just filed in Florida in the House level. Representative Anthony Sabatini, maybe Andrew Nappi, if you're out there watching or listening, you can tell me if this guy has been good in the past, but the legislation looked pretty solid. Basically, it would allow anyone over 21 who can demonstrate, quote, competency with a firearm to obtain a concealed carry permit. Anyone who is legally allowed. Oh, okay, here we go. Anyone who is legally allowed to own a gun could carry it concealed without a state-issued license under HB 273. So we'll be watching that. There's a lot of committees that things go through in Florida, and the Republicans, the establishment Republicans, are very anti-gun there, even when they campaign otherwise. But so far, this piece of legislation looks pretty positive in Florida. Anyways, looking over at the live chat here, Michael White says, the problem is young people don't like individual responsibility. I would say old people don't like individual responsibility either. I would not blame this on age, young, old, or in between. People do not like freedom, or they're afraid of it. As John Adams told us in 1776, fear is the foundation of most governments. I would just remove the word most, and people are afraid of freedom. So therefore, they want government to come in and protect us. This chat is getting stronger. Great commenter says, Frank... Two-Way Fishing says, I blame the actual people that enforce those laws, not the people who write them. See, again, I wouldn't pit one versus the other. The people who write them are to blame. The people who turn a blind eye to them are to blame. The people who demand them are to blame. And the people who enforce them, the cops, the law enforcement, they are all to blame. There's a huge problem in this country. A lot of people, again, are afraid of freedom. They don't understand freedom, and it's important to demonstrate to them that freedom actually works. And again, I go back to the marijuana issue back in 1996 when California here passed Proposition 215. You wouldn't find too many conservatives supporting it. And in fact, when I started this organization in the mid-2000s, I would talk about this as an example. I've been talking about it all along. Look, if you want to do something, legalize what the federal government prohibits. You can do the same thing on healthcare freedom, on guns, on money. We saw, for example, Proposition 9 in Texas passed yesterday, which will implement the removal of some roadblocks to the use of the Texas Gold Depository, even though, well, that's its own episode. Essential Freedom put it this way: free people don't ask permission to make from the government to make decisions about their lives. Absolutely. And Richard Kramer, those peace officers have sworn an oath to uphold and defend the U.S. Constitution and their state constitution. And absolutely, it's essential to point out that they are not upholding their oath when they enforce stuff that violates the Constitution. There should be way less enforcement on virtually everything, not more. So I agree. It's a very big problem here. I do want to say hi to Patricia Dance as well, who says she's going to go back to the beginning when this finishes. Austin Broderson, good to see you, buddy. Austin, I met he and his lovely wife, now wife, when we were on the Contra cruise a couple of years ago, Tom Woods and Bob Murphy. What a great event. Frank I says the 1968 Gun Control Act is almost word for word the same as the 1938 German Nazi Gun Control Act. I didn't know that. Frank, if you happen to have a link to the German one, that's just an interesting piece. If you can email me, team@10thamendmentcenter.com, all spelled out again, team@10thamendmentcenter.com. Winged Infinity says state sovereignty, simple concept, simple fact. Not many people understand it. And again, I want to reaffirm the point that even Madison clarified this in his famous report of 1800. When we talk about state rights or state sovereignty, he's talking about the people of the several states have that sovereignty, because government can never have final authority. Timothy Martin says the congressional record from 1934 regarding the NFA is an interesting read, especially the NRA's testimony. NRA has been backing these things all along. Essential Freedom, all guns are legal under the Second Amendment. We absolutely know that the founders wanted the people to have military-style weapons because they were so concerned about the power of standing armies, the danger of standing armies. This was a universal concern. Many of the founders wanted no standing army. Others wanted no standing army, but recognized and allowed for it to happen in short periods. None of them wanted a permanent standing army or a large one, which is, we've got all of it today. And one of the reasons that you wouldn't need one is if the population is armed to the teeth with military-style weaponry. Anyways, that's their view as well. And David McNamee is right. The right to keep and bear arms was not granted. It is inherent. Attempting to violate this right will only result in pain and heartbreak. The first part I absolutely agree with. The fact of the matter is there have been very successful attempts to violate this right for decades and decades. If we're talking about on the federal level, I'm not even talking about the state stuff, which is bad as well. Talking about the federal level, we're talking about over 80 years, nearly 90 years of federal gun control on the books being enforced by Washington, D.C., and with the help of states and local governments. And that's why it's time for states and localities to withdraw their support from this, because the federal ATF does not have the resources or capacity to do all the enforcement if tens of millions of people are simply rejecting them. Anyways, I'm going on and on at this point. I'm running along again on this show. I hope you learned something from this. That's the most important. I hope you take action and get those links. Keep an eye out over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. I will post the links to the model legislation for state and local Second Amendment preservation acts or ordinances. We also sent this out as an email to our list this morning. If you're one of our ongoing members, I'm very grateful for that. You'll get that a little bit later today. I ran out of time as I was kind of segmenting that out. If you do want to support what we're doing, make sure to continue leaving comments, smash the like button wherever you're watching or listening, leave a review on iTunes. That helps us a ton. All these types of actions trigger the algorithms of the platform you watch or listen on, and it tells that platform to show the program to more people. And if you want to pitch in financially, as little as $2 a month goes a long, long way. That's 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, I'm very grateful. I'm sorry I was not able to keep up with all of the, I got one more in the live chat. Andrew Nappy, my buddy down in Florida, longtime 10th Amendment Center volunteer and supporter, says the sword and all terrible implements are of the soldier. are the birthright of an American. That's Tench Coxe, an important founder that a lot of people don't know about, and maybe that's why. Anyways, I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed this. I'm very grateful for you spending some time with me today. I'll see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.